From Canada in the Toronto Sky Dome, this is Democracy Now!
What's the White House's perspective on Duterte and him coming here?
Well, I think it is an opportunity for us to work with countries in that region that can help play a role in diplomatically and economically isolating North Korea.
Over the past year, Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte has overseen a bloody war on drugs that's left over 7,000 people dead. While human rights groups have slammed Duterte, President Trump has embraced him. We'll speak with Jeremy Scahill of The Intercept. He's just published a leaked transcript of the call between the two presidents, where Trump says Duterte is doing an unbelievable job on the drug problem. We'll also speak to Jeremy and Glenn Greenwald about how the media coverage of the Manchester bombing victims should be a model for all young victims of war, from Yemen to Afghanistan. Plus, we'll speak to Toronto activist and journalist Desmond Cole.
I think what was revealed is a certain naivety in Toronto, where we ignore very obvious problems of racial discrimination and systemic racism because we want to tell ourselves that it's not happening here, and we especially want to tell ourselves that we are not the United States of America.
Up until recently, Desmond Cole was a columnist at the Toronto Star, but his editors told him he had to choose between being a journalist or a Black Lives Matter activist. He decided to stop writing his column. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from Toronto, Canada. In new revelations about possible collusion between the Trump campaign and alleged Russian efforts to influence the 2016 election, the New York Times is reporting U.S. spies heard senior Russian political and intelligence officials discussing ways to use then-Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort and Trump advisor Michael Flynn in order to exert influence over Donald Trump himself. In the alleged conversations last summer, the Russian officials reportedly bragged about their close ties to Michael Flynn, as well as to former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, who's worked closely with Manafort. It's not known whether Russian officials ever actually tried to influence Manafort or Flynn, or, if so, whether they were successful. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reporting former FBI Director James Comey may have been influenced by a fake Russian intelligence document when he decided to publicly denounce Hillary Clinton's handling of emails as extremely careless in July. Officials say the secret Russian intelligence document claimed then-Attorney General Loretta Lynch had assured the Clinton campaign the FBI would not probe too deeply into Clinton's use of a private email server while she was Secretary of State. The Post reports Comey relied heavily on that document when he took the extraordinary step of announcing, without Justice Department involvement, that although the FBI investigation was over, he found Clinton's conduct to be extremely careless. Officials now say the FBI itself had suspected the document was bad intelligence or even fake. CNN's reporting Attorney General Jeff Sessions did not reveal his two meetings last year with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak when he applied for his security clearances to serve as Attorney General. These are the same two meetings Sessions failed to disclose during his confirmation hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee. The Congressional Budget Office says the new Republican health care plan would cause 23 million people to lose their health care by 2026. The plan narrowly passed the House early this month. It's not clear whether the bill will pass the Senate. This is New York Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer.
The report makes clear Trump care would be a cancer on the American health care system, causing costs to skyrocket, making coverage unaffordable for those with pre-existing conditions and many seniors, and kicking millions off their health insurance. Unless you're a healthy millionaire, Trump care is a nightmare.
President Trump was greeted by 9,000 angry protesters when he arrived in Belgium Wednesday as part of his first foreign trip as president. Last year, Trump sparked outrage when he described Brussels as a hellhole because it had welcomed so many immigrants and refugees. This is protester Anne Tanglet.
Trump is a great example of appalling machismo. He wants to destroy the planet. He wants to destroy people. We are not insignificant. We are 99% of the planet against 1% billionaires, the only ones that Trump represents.
In Brussels, Trump will be attending his first NATO summit today. In news on Yemen, the human rights group Reprieve says U.S. Navy SEALs killed 5 civilians during a raid Tuesday night on a village in Marib Governorate. The Pentagon says the raid targeted al-Qaeda and that 7 militants were killed. But residents of the village say the Navy SEALs actually shot and killed a 70-year-old civilian, a partially blind man who'd come out of his house during the raid to see what was going on. At the sound of gunfire, 4 more civilians reportedly came out of their houses only to be gunned down by the SEALs. Reprieve says another 6 civilians were injured, including an elderly man. This comes after Navy SEALs killed up to 25 civilians, including 9 children, during a botched raid in Yemen in January that also left 1 Navy SEAL dead. Meanwhile, in more news on Yemen, nearly 400 people have now died in a spiraling cholera outbreak, as the U.S.-backed Saudi-led bombing campaign has devastated the country's health, water, sewage, and sanitation systems. In Brazil, President Michel Temer has authorized the deployment of the army to the capital, Brasilia, amid growing protests demanding the president's ouster. On Wednesday, tens of thousands of protesters marched to Congress to demand Temer's resignation. Some demonstrators also torched a ministry building. Multiple protesters were injured as police attacked them with tear gas, stun grenades, and rubber-coated steel bullets. Temer is facing mounting calls to resign or be impeached following explosive testimony released by the Supreme Court accusing him of accepting millions of dollars in bribes since 2010. We'll have more on Brazil later in the broadcast with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, who lives in Rio de Janeiro. Shocking new details have come to light about how the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration tried to cover up its role in the killing of 4 civilians in Honduras in 2012. For years, the DEA claimed they were assisting Honduran authorities in a raid that killed 4 drug smugglers near the village of Ajuas. This was the story the DEA told Congress, the Justice Department, and the public. But a scathing new report by the Inspectors General of the Justice and State Departments says the DEA repeatedly lied about key aspects of the raid. The victims were not drug smugglers, but civilians, including 2 pregnant women traveling on a water taxi. In addition, the report says the DEA falsely claimed that Honduran law enforcement had led the operation when, in fact, it was led by the DEA. The agents report of a now shuttered task force known as the Foreign Deployed Advisory Support Team, or FAST, which was trained in military-style and anti-drug raids. Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy said the report, quote, unmasks egregious events and conduct, as well as the subsequent efforts to hide the truth about what happened. British officials are accusing the United States of leaking to the news media details about the investigation into Monday's suicide bombing in Manchester, which killed 22 people. The officials say they'll no longer share information with the U.S. after U.S. law enforcement agencies released information and pictures about the investigation before British agencies did so. UK Prime Minister Theresa May says she'll raise the issue when she meets with President Trump today during a NATO summit in Brussels. The leaks come as British authorities have arrested a total of 8 men suspected of being connected to the attack, including suspected bomber Salman Abidi's brother, Ismail. Abidi was a 22-year-old British man whose parents emigrated from Libya. Abidi's brother, Hashim, and his father have also been arrested by special forces in Libya. The Italian Coast Guard says at least 34 refugees, including many small toddlers, have died after their boat capsized off the coast of Libya Wednesday as the refugees were trying to reach Europe. Their deaths come as a new report says as many as 6.6 million people are waiting in countries around the Mediterranean, hoping to emigrate to Europe. Back in the United States, in Montana, Republican congressional candidate Greg Gianforte has been charged with assault after he body-slammed a Guardian reporter to the floor Wednesday night, only hours before polls opened for the special election today. Gianforte, a tech millionaire who's backed by President Trump, attacked Guardian reporter Ben Jacobs as Jacobs was trying to ask the Republican about the Republican health care plan. This is audio Jacobs captured of the incident.
We'll talk to you about that later.
Yeah, but there's not going to be time. I'm just curious if you have the action
Speak
right
with
now.
Shane, please.
But you don't.
Sick and tired of you guys. The last time that came in here, you did the same thing. Get the hell out of here. Jesus. Get the hell out of here. The last guy did the same thing. You were the guardian.
Yes, and you just broke my glasses.
The last guy did the same damn thing.
You just body slammed me and broke my glasses.
Get the hell out of here.
If you'd like me to get the hell out of here, I'd also like to call the police.
That was reporter Ben Jacobs being attacked by Montana congressional candidate Greg Gianforte Wednesday night. Voters are now heading to the polls to decide between Gianforte and Democratic candidate Rob Quist to fill Montana's at-large House seat, which was vacated by now Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke. The $10 million closely watched race is seen as a referendum on the Trump administration. Close to 70% of the people in Montana have already voted in that congressional race. And protests against corporate shareholder meetings continued Wednesday. In Chicago, crowds of baggage handlers, janitors, cabin cleaners, and security officers rallied outside the United Airlines shareholder meeting, demanding higher wages and better working conditions. Inside the meeting, United CEO Oscar Munoz was grilled by shareholders over the violent removal of a doctor who suffered a concussion, broken nose, and lost teeth after he was dragged semi-conscious off a plane after refusing to be, quote, involuntarily rebooked, unquote, from a flight. Meanwhile, in the Chicago suburb of Oak Park, hundreds of fast food workers protested outside the McDonald's shareholder meeting to demand the minimum wage be raised to $15 an hour. This is one of the protesters.
We deserve dignity. We deserve $15 an hour. We deserve to be able to take care of our kids. My son, I can't even buy him any shoes. I haven't bought him any shoes all year long. He hasn't had shoes, and he deserves to be able to have some shoes on his feet, just like I'm quite sure the shareholders, they take care of their families.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
And welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today's show looking at the Philippines, where Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte has been overseeing a bloody war on drugs. Since last June, more than 7,000 people have been extrajudicially killed by police or vigilantes. Duterte has also suggested he might impose martial law across the country after first declaring it this week in his native island of Mindanao. While human rights groups have condemned Duterte, he has received backing from President Trump, who recently invited him to visit the White House. Human Rights Watch slammed the invitation, saying, quote, by effectively endorsing Duterte's murderous war on drugs, Trump has made himself morally complicit in future killings. Well, earlier this week, a transcript of the call of Trump inviting Duterte to the White House was leaked and published by The Intercept. According to the leaked transcript, Trump said, quote, I just wanted to congratulate you because I am hearing of the unbelievable job on the drug problem. Many countries have the problem, we have the problem, but what a great job you are doing, and I just wanted to call and tell you that. Duterte responded, quote, thank you, Mr. President. This is the scourge of my nation now, and I have to do something to preserve the Filipino nation. Trump then responded, quote, I understand that and fully understand that, and I think we had a previous president who did not understand that, but I understand that, and we have spoken about this before. On May 1, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer was asked about Trump's decision to invite Duterte to the White House.
Chris Coons said that the president is giving his stamp of approval to human rights abuses. Governor John Sununu, on the other hand, said this is part of the unpleasant things that presidents have to do. What's the White House's perspective on Duterte and him coming here?
Well, I think it is an opportunity for us to work with countries in that region that can help play a role in diplomatically and economically isolating North Korea. And frankly, the national interests of the United States, the safety of our people and the safety of people in the region are the #1 priorities of the president.
The leaked transcript of the Trump-Duterte call does confirm North Korea came up, but only after Trump praised the Filipino president on waging his war on drugs. During the call, Trump said, quote, "We have a lot of firepower over there. We have 2 submarines, the best in the world. We have 2 nuclear submarines, not that we want to use them at all." Trump went on to say, "I've never seen anything like they are, but we don't have to use this. But he could be crazy, so we'll see what happens," unquote. Well, to talk more about Presidents Trump and Duterte, we're joined by Jeremy Scahill, co-founder of The Intercept, host of the new weekly podcast, Intercepted. Jeremy's recently co-wrote a 3-part article on the leaked call for The Intercept. Jeremy, it's great to have you with us here at the Sky Dome, where the Blue Jays play, in Toronto, Canada, where we all participated in a forum on journalism last night. But talk about this really explosive expose that you did for The Intercept around Trump's phone call with Duterte.
First of all, just to establish what this is that we published, this was a transcript from a phone call that took place on April 29th between Trump and Duterte, and Trump initiated the call. What we published was a Philippine government document, a classified Philippine government document. So this was the transcript that Duterte's people made of his call with Trump. The reason I emphasize that is because after we published this, Matt Drudge put it at the top of Drudge Report, and so we had an enormous surge in traffic from many people who are supporters of Donald Trump. And we got bombarded, and Drudge got bombarded with a boycott campaign from Trump supporters who were saying whoever leaked this should be prosecuted for treason, and the journalists who published this should be put in prison, which echoes what we know Trump has sort of suggested in meetings most recently to James Comey right before he fired him, the idea that journalists should be arrested. This was not a U.S. government document. Also, people were saying, oh, this is proof that Obama left the White House bugged. That, it's like they don't understand the basic fact of when 2 foreign leaders are speaking, there's 2 sides to this conversation. So there we have it. We have the phone conversation between these 2.
How'd you get it?
So, well, we're not going to talk about sources or methods, as the U.S. government likes to talk about. All we'll say is that we obtained it, and both the White House and the Philippines government, the Philippines government validated that it is a legitimate document. The White House said that the transcript was accurate. Now, what does that leave us with? Well, it leaves us with the fact that Donald Trump begins a phone call with Rodrigo Duterte, who is one of the most unrepentant, murderous heads of state in the world today, openly brags about how he'll give a pardon or immunity to people who extrajudicially kill anyone involved with the drug war. And the dominant perception and the way that this is portrayed by Duterte's people is that they're just going after narco traffickers. In reality, many drug users have been assassinated as part of this campaign. Duterte actually enjoys a pretty wide base of support in the Philippines, and he kind of mixes in anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist rhetoric with these very harsh policies. He also is one of the few heads of state in the world who will, he regularly swears. I mean, he called Barack Obama things that I can't even say on this program, the son of a, and then referenced his, as though Obama's mother had been a sex worker. I mean, he's, calling the president of the United States and saying, I'm going to divorce the United States and orient myself toward China and Russia. And he said that under Obama, because Obama's administration criticized the tactics that Duterte was using, the kind of paramilitary gangster tactics that they were using. And I think the most, not astonishing, but the most relevant part of this is that Trump knows all of that and in fact views that as a positive thing. So he calls Duterte and says to him, Rodrigo, I just want to congratulate you for the amazing job that you're doing. And the reason that we know it's not just kind of generic platitudes is because Trump himself references in this call the fact that his predecessor, Barack Obama, had said the obvious, which is, this is not right, the way that this is being handled. And, the Obama administration had a very hypocritical record on human rights. But as Alan Nairn has pointed out before, hypocrisy has some virtue in the sense that at least you're able to call them out on it because they say one thing but mean another. So the bottom line is Trump calls Duterte and says, great job, amazing job. Obama, he didn't get it I get it. You have our full support. You're a good man.
Jeremy, I wanted to ask you, almost as shocking as the call and the congratulations from Trump was the other part of the discussion about North Korea and Trump revealing to Duterte and obviously to lots of folks in the Philippine government about nuclear submarines of the U.S. that are off the coast of North Korea.
Right. I mean, well, first of all, we know that Trump still continues to use an insecure cell phone that he tweets from, and has brought that cell phone to the table on classified discussions about North Korea. He did it when Shinzo Abe was at Mar-a-Lago with him, the Japanese leader. There were photos of Trump's cell phone. His specific phone that he uses has been already that phone for years. It's been known to have been compromised by Chinese hackers. So Trump is bringing this insecure phone to meetings about North Korea. Then he's on the phone with Duterte last month, and he says, we've got these 2 nuclear subs near North Korea. And he's saying this to Duterte, who is most certainly under surveillance by both the North Koreans and the Chinese. So anyone who says, oh, well, you guys revealed this information, the most damaging revelation of classified information happened when Donald Trump told Duterte this. And Duterte also is a very clever operator when it comes to China, and he has called Vladimir Putin his hero. But the most newsworthy aspect of that is that, and I felt bad for you, Amy, having to read those quotes from Trump, because when you actually read his words and you're not Trump, it sounds like the garbled mess that it actually is, because you don't have the inflection and you're not, sniffling and all these things. But Trump tells Duterte about these submarines off the coast, and he says, we've got so much more firepower than North Korea, at least 20 times more. 20 times? The United States is known to have more than 6,000 nuclear warheads. North Korea is believed to have around 10. So Trump's math was way off in that equation. And some people were saying, oh, well, Trump keeps saying we don't want to use it, we don't want to use it. That's not what's significant. What's significant is that Trump says this is a madman, we don't know what he's going to do, we'd prefer not to go to war, but who knows? That's really frightening to hear from someone who is in command of the most lethal and powerful military in the world. He also, and this is sort of sad on one level, but also frightening, he says, Rodrigo, let's talk about Kim Jong-un. Is he stable or unstable? Huh? I mean, why is the President of the United States asking Duterte about if Kim Jong-un is unstable?
A man whose own stability is in question, Duterte.
Right, yeah, of course. But this is 3 madmen that are in this equation, Trump, Duterte, and Kim Jong-un. And I really don't know which of these 3 people is a sort of greater threat to civilization. I mean, it's probably Trump, but it's,
Let's go to some of the clips of Duterte in his own words. Last September, the Philippines president likened himself to Hitler.
Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Now, there's a 3 million drug addicts. There are. I'd be happy to slaughter them. At least, if Germany had Hitler, the Philippines would have, but, my victims, I would like to be all criminals.
Last fall, Duterte called then-President Obama son of a whore and warned him not to ask about his so-called drug war.
I am a president of a sovereign state, and we have long ceased to be a colony. I do not have any master except the Filipino people. Nobody but nobody. You must be respectful. Do not just throw away questions and statements.
Son of a... I will swear at you in that forum.
Before he was elected, Duterte admitted he was linked to a death squad in Davao. He spoke on a local TV show in a mix of English and Visayan.
Me. They are saying I'm part of a death squad.
So how do you react to that?
True. That's true. You know, when I become president, I warn you, I don't covet the position. But if I become president, the 1,000 will become 50,000. I will kill all of you who make the lives of Filipinos miserable. I will really kill you. I won because of the breakdown in law and order.
Meanwhile, in December, Duterte boasted about having personally killed criminal suspects when he was mayor of Davao City. The Manila Times reported he told a group of business leaders in the Philippines capital, quote, "In Davao, I used to do it personally, just to show to the guys that if I can do it, why can't you?" And I'd go around in Davao with a motorcycle, with a big bike around, and I would just patrol the streets looking for trouble. Also, I was really looking for a confrontation so I could kill. Jeremy, I mean, these comments from a president of the Philippines.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, those, of course, are of a more serious nature than the kinds of things that come out of Donald Trump's mouth. But they do have that in common, where, you know, they'll just sort of say what they're thinking, and in a way, it's refreshing, I guess, because most world leaders try to cover up the uncouth actions that they're, you know, taking in their countries. What I think is really significant for people to understand is that in the Hitler quote, where Duterte is saying, you know, Germany had Hitler, and you know, he underestimates the number of people that Hitler killed. You know, he says 3 million. But he doesn't say we have 3 million narco traffickers that I want to kill. He says we have 3 million addicts. And that's the point here, is they're not going after the kind of, you know, Chapo of the Philippines. Many of the people that have been killed are rank and file victims of a drug culture, and that's who's paying the heaviest price for all of this.
I want to ask you about something else in those transcripts. The short discussion between Trump and Duterte toward the end about China and Xi Jinping, the president of China, that Trump said, "Oh, I met with him in Mar-a-Lago. He's a really good guy." Yeah. You know, this is after months and months of Trump's China bashing here and during the political campaign. All of a sudden, he seems to indicate that he needs to rely on China. China is the critical country in being able to keep North Korea at bay.
Well, and you know, that has sort of, you know, under Obama, they called the policy on North Korea strategic patience. And I think that all serious observers of Korea politics and the history of Korea know that the North Korean regime is largely dependent on China for basically its survival in many ways, in addition to the smuggling and organized crime that the North Korean regime is involved with. But on a tactical level, Trump spends his, you know, a couple of days with Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago. And then he's saying to Duterte, "Oh, we've got to get the Chinese to solve the problem." And Duterte's like, "Oh yeah, I'll give him a call." It really shows how out of his depth Trump is, as though he just heard, "Oh, maybe China could do something about this." I mean, it's frightening when you're talking about the presence of nuclear weapons. China plays the United States like a fiddle all the time in international relations.
We just have 30 seconds before we'll go to break, and then we'll also be joined by Glenn Greenwald. But so Duterte is coming to the White House. Is that clear?
Well, Donald Trump, says to him, you know, anytime you're in Washington, come by. I would love to have you in the White House. After we published this, Senator Lindsey Graham, you know, said that he may join with Democrats who are calling for Trump to postpone that trip so that they can discuss these issues. And I mean, I do think that what's interesting, he just declared martial law in the south of the country, Duterte did, and he's doing it in the name of fighting terrorism. That part of what Duterte is doing has long been aided by the United States, the Joint Special Operations Command, the CIA, military intelligence. The U.S. has poured resources into the Philippines in the name of fighting Islamist rebels. Duterte is now adopting that rhetoric, just like Bush and Trump, you know, Obama had different terms for it, are talking about this fight. In a way, it seems as though Duterte is outsmarting Trump in terms of how this is all playing.
Jeremy Scahill is going to stay with us, co-founder of The Intercept, host of the new weekly podcast, Intercepted. His most recent piece will link to Trump called Rodrigo Duterte to congratulate him on his murderous drug war. You're doing an amazing job. Jeremy's books include Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, more recently, The Assassination Complex Inside the Government's Secret Drone Warfare Program. This is Democracy Now! Back with Jeremy and Glenn Greenwald in a moment.
Ako'y sinilang sa isang bayan ng Cotabato, kasing gulo ng tao, kasing gulo ng mundo. Dahil di magkasundo sa relihiyon at prinsipyo, kasing gulo ng isip ko. Di alam saan nang galing, di alam saan patungo. Kapatid sa kapatid, laman sa laman, sila-silang naglalaban. Di ko alam ang dahilan ng gulo. Bakit nagkaganon ang sagot?
Cotabato by a scene here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez, and we're broadcasting from the Sky Dome, where the Toronto Blue Jays play, in Toronto, Canada. We were here for a journalism conference along with our guests, Jeremy Scahill and Glenn Greenwald. Juan?
Well, in Britain, police are expanding their investigation into Monday's suicide bombing in Manchester that killed 22 and left dozens injured. Many of those killed were young girls. While the Manchester story has dominated international headlines, far less attention has been paid to other stories this week involving the deaths of civilians. In Syria and Iraq, U.S.-led or U.S.-backed airstrikes have killed dozens of civilians in the last week alone. The journalistic monitoring group Airways says airstrikes on Sunday and Monday reportedly killed up to 44 civilians in Mosul. One local journalist said, quote, the bombing caused the deaths of more than 20 civilians who were burned in their homes, mostly women and children, unquote. In Syria, Air War says the U.S.-led coalition airstrikes near Raqqa reportedly killed up to 15 civilians, including 2 children on Sunday. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says U.S.-led airstrikes have killed 225 civilians over the past month, including 44 children.
Meanwhile, in Yemen, the human rights group Reprieve says U.S. Navy SEALs killed 5 civilians during a raid Tuesday night on a village in Marib Governorate. The killings reportedly began after a 70-year-old civilian named Nasser al-Athal came out of his home to find out what was going on and was gunned down by the SEALs. The Pentagon says the raid targeted al-Qaeda and that 7 militants were killed. To talk more about how the media covers civilian casualties, we're joined by the co-founders of The Intercept, Jeremy Scahill and Glenn Greenwald. Glenn, should the Manchester model be used for other victims of war? The model of, well, I mean, we know about the 22 victims, the horrific attack, the suicide attack in Manchester, as these tweens, these mainly little girls, 10, 12, 11, 13, attended the Ariana Grande concert. We've learned the kids' names, a number of them, their parents had come to pick up their children. And our hearts grieve because we know who they are. They could be our families. We don't know the names of the children in Yemen who died in a Navy SEAL attack a few days after President Trump became president. A Navy SEAL died, but also at least 30 civilians died, and among them women and children.
Yeah, we all do media criticism of various types, and I know over the years I've voiced all kinds of critiques of U.S. media coverage, but if I had the power to just overnight remedy one of them, this discrepancy is the one that I would choose, because think about how powerful it is, just the effect that it has on us as human beings, even just randomly when it pops into our Twitter timeline or onto our Facebook page. You see the name and the story and the grieving relatives of someone who was killed at this concert in Manchester. No matter how rational you are, you feel anger, you feel empathy, you feel so emotionally moved by the horror of the violence that was perpetrated. So imagine if there was any kind of balance whatsoever where we knew the names of any of the victims of the indiscriminate violence of our own government, let alone the comprehensive coverage of the victims that is devoted when we are the victims of violence. How much that would affect the perception that we have of the violence that our own government perpetrates. We keep it so abstract. We usually just hear 14 people died. The Pentagon claims that it's militants and terrorists. It's left at that. At best, we hear they finally acknowledge 4 civilians are killed, but it's kept very ethereal feel very distant and abstract. We never learn their names. As you said, we never hear from their families. We never hear their life aspirations extinguished. And if there was just some attention paid to telling the stories of the victims of our own government's violence, I think there'd be a radical shift in how we perceive of ourselves, the role we play in the world, and who bears blame in this conflict.
Well, I mean, look at how many times we read or hear reports that the United States has bombed a wedding party or a funeral, and there is never a description of, well, who was the bride, who was the groom, who were the people that were killed and what were their dreams. It's unfathomable to me that if we had a wedding party in the United States that was somehow bombed in a terrorist incident, that we wouldn't know the names of every single person who was killed. We would have heard about where the people were going to go on their honeymoon, and what the bride looked like when she was preparing for. We hear nothing about any of these people that are killed with our tax dollars in our name. Trump just inked this deal with the Saudis for well over $100 billion. It could be as much as $400 billion when it's all said and done. Defense stocks go to record highs. What are those weapons going to be used for? Well, in the immediate future, they're going to be used for what they're being used for now, which is to utterly destroy Yemen, where the United States and Saudi Arabia are absolutely razing to the ground the poorest country in the Arab world, and have caused a catastrophic health crisis in that country, which already was facing a total completion of their water supply. We don't think about victims of war in the same way that we talk about victims of school shootings in this country, or victims of terrorism when ISIS claims responsibility for it. It's a problem.
I want to ask you in the broader context. The refugee crisis now that is engulfing Europe, with the headline 6 million people waiting to be able to emigrate into Europe. We don't in the press cover what is the basis of this refugee crisis. What the reality is that when it comes to Iraq, it's been 20 years of warfare in Iraq, in Syria, Libya, Afghanistan. You have this in Democratic and Republican administrations. So basically, it's been the interventions and the military actions of the West that have created the refugee crisis, destabilized these countries, made it impossible for the people to stay. I'm surprised that more people haven't left Afghanistan than have already tried to flee to Europe.
Well, it's much more difficult to get out of Afghanistan, but you're totally right. The U.S. wars did this.
Yeah, what's so strange about it is in our own personal lives, if we have friends or family members who compulsively blame other people and look for fault on other people and never accept responsibility for their own actions and the way that it contributes to problems, we say, this is a real pathology. You need to start thinking about how it is that your own actions contribute to problems. And yet the number one rule of U.S. media discourse is that whenever there's violence or attacks, the one thing we don't want to do is think about the role we played in provoking it. And what's particularly ironic about it is that when it comes to other countries, we're really good at doing that. For example, if ISIS shoots down a Russian plane, or someone inspired by ISIS kills a Russian ambassador in Turkey, instantly, overnight, every pundit, every media outlet blames Russian foreign policy. They say the reason this happened is because the Russians are bombing in Syria, or because the Russians have provoked ISIS around the world. We make that causal connection when it comes to our enemies, but to make that causal connection when it comes to ourselves, there were warnings that if if the UK invaded Iraq, or if the UK began bombing in Syria, they would have exactly the kind of terrorist attacks that just happened in Manchester. But to talk about the causal connection there becomes instantly taboo. And what that means is that we just don't examine the policies that are invoked in the name of stopping terrorism that are actually doing more to fuel and provoke terrorism than any other single factor.
Can I just add one small part of this? I can't shake this guy from my existence, but Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, who has been serving as a shadow advisor to the Trump administration, he was on Fox News last week in primetime on Tucker Carlson's show. Tucker, of course, took over from Bill O'Reilly. And the two big points that Eric Prince was pushing, one was we need to put mercenaries in charge of the war in Afghanistan. And he likened it to the British campaign in India, which was a murderous campaign where Churchill boasted about the use of chemical weapons. So it's an interesting analog that Prince is using for his proposal on private companies taking over the war in Afghanistan. But the second point that he made is The left is completely nuts in the United States because they loved the Soviet Union when it was a left-wing repressive government, and now they're demonizing Putin just because he's not part of the Soviet Union, but he's the same kind of an authoritarian. And isn't it great that Trump has brought these two countries together? What's interesting about that is that Prince himself is at the tip of the spear of a move to try to monetize the refugee crisis right now. His solution is to get countries and thugs in countries like Libya to get into business with the European Union to actually prevent people from leaving North Africa or parts of the Middle East to come into Europe. And he wants to do it with a privatized maritime force accompanied by Western military advisors working with local militias. This whole administration, in a way, is up for sale. And when you have people like Eric Prince, who are masterful mercenaries running around the scene, and they're your biggest advocate in the U.S. media when it comes to the Russia issue, it raises a lot of questions. I do think the Democrats have lost their minds with not seeing some value to having peaceful relations between Russia and the United States. The problem is I'm not sure that that's what Trump is actually doing. But there's a lot up for sale right now, and I think the Democrats are blowing a lot of opportunities by just focusing on a narrow aspect of Trump's buffoonery, because there's a lot of high-stakes stuff going on.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask about Julian Assange. The Swedish government has dropped the investigation into allegations of sexual misconduct by Julian Assange. He was never charged. What does this mean, Glenn? Glenn, you're, of course, the person who won the Pulitzer Prize for your work covering Edward Snowden. Right now, Julian Assange has been in the Ecuadorian embassy for almost 5 years. But if he steps foot outside, even though Sweden has dropped this investigation, after questioning him at the embassy, the British government.
I think it's obviously, a shame, and I think everyone ought to agree that when there are allegations of this type that are made and then denials issued by the person who is accused, it's in everybody's interest to try and make sure that these claims are adjudicated not through online debate, but in a court of law with due process. And the fact that it hasn't been and apparently won't be, I think is horrible for everybody involved. The reason why that happened, and a lot of people bear the blame for it, but the primary reason is that what the Ecuadorians said all along was that what we're concerned about, the persecution we're protecting him from, is not the allegations in Sweden, but the concern that if he goes to Sweden, he will then be turned over to the United States and be prosecuted for political crimes, namely publishing documents. And the Ecuadorians always said if the Swedish would just give us assurances that turning over Julian to the Swedish authorities will not result in him being extradited to the U.S., we will put him on the next plane to Stockholm to face these claims. And Julian has said the same thing, and the Swedish refused categorically to give those assurances, which is why the Ecuadorians perceived persecution and gave asylum. On top of which, the prosecutors took many, many years to question Julian in the embassy, which they were offering all along and could have done 5 years ago and didn't. Now we're at a situation where the Swedish investigators have said, we don't think we can proceed anymore, so we're dropping the charges, which means every fair-minded person should not assume Julian to be innocent, but also not guilty, because there's been no due process. And so why is he still in the embassy? The reason he's still in the embassy and can't leave is exactly what the Ecuadorians fear, which is that the United States government has made clear under Trump that they intend to prosecute WikiLeaks and Julian Assange under an espionage statute enacted in 1917 for the quote-unquote crime of publishing documents. And the British, of course, as being the British, are entirely subservient to the wishes of the U.S. government and will arrest Julian the minute he steps out and undoubtedly turn him over to the U.S. So the irony is he's not been convicted. The charges are now dropped, and yet he seems to be in greater legal.
Charged.
Right, he's never been charged. The case has been dropped, the investigation has been dropped, and yet he's in greater legal jeopardy than ever because Jeff Sessions and Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump apparently want to prosecute him for the crime of reporting on documents. And there's a lot of people in the U.S. media who, even though that precedent would be a grave danger to their own press freedom, seem to be either acquiescing to it or overtly supportive of it, and it's a really dangerous situation.
I think a lot of what is missed in the criticism of Assange and WikiLeaks from news organizations is that what they do to WikiLeaks, and if they do charge Julian Assange with espionage, if they do criminalize what WikiLeaks is doing, that's a threat to journalists everywhere. And regardless of what you think of Julian Assange as a person or the allegations that originally surfaced in Sweden, this is a tactic that the U.S. government uses all the time. That's what the whole embedded journalism program is part of in the military. Embedded journalists, remember Victoria Clark, Bush's spokesperson on military stuff during the invasion of Iraq. Unembedded journalists were basically fair game, and if we end up killing you, that's your problem. But if you're embedded, you have to go through the censors, you're working with us. Look at the way that also journalists talked about this recent Israel leak story in the Oval Office when the Russians were there. CNN, all these publications rushed in front of the cameras and microphones to say, we coordinated our coverage with the U.S. government to make sure that we wouldn't say this, this, or this. Now, that's fair. You should ask the U.S. government, I think, when you're publishing documents, let's hear your argument for why this shouldn't be. The idea that Evan Perez on CNN used the term coordinated to talk about what they were doing with the U.S. government before publishing things is really the sharpest contrast that you can draw. WikiLeaks versus journalists who go and say, Mr. President, is it okay if we publish this? That's a problem, and that's why, regardless of what you think of WikiLeaks, if you are not against their prosecution under this, then you're going to be part of a drawing back of press freedom in the United States.
We are wrapping up in 30 seconds, Glenn, but tomorrow we're going to broadcast an exclusive interview with the ousted Brazilian president, Dilma Rousseff. You've just flown in from Brazil. As a kind of introduction to this, can you say what's happening there?
It's hard to imagine anyone more vindicated than she. The argument that a lot of us made against the impeachment was that if you impeach her, the people in Brazil who will take over are the single most corrupt faction. They're like a criminal organization. The president of the country just got caught on tape 3 months ago endorsing and directing bribes. There is all kinds of unrest in Brasilia. My husband was just there yesterday. And you have no idea now that we've unraveled democracy what the result will be.
Well, we will talk about that with Dilma Rousseff tomorrow on Democracy Now!, as well as Glenn's analysis of what's happening now with the president, Michel Temer, sending thousands of troops to Brasilia. Glenn Greenwald, Jeremy Scahill, both co-founders of The Intercept, and Jeremy has just started a new weekly podcast called Intercepted. Check it out. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. When we come back, we speak with Toronto journalist and activist Desmond Cole. Stay with us.
crosses on wood at the door.
Burn the Witch, Radiohead, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez, and we are broadcasting from, well, the stadium where the Blue Jays play. That's right, we're in Toronto, Canada, at the Sky Dome. Juan?
I choose activism in the service of black liberation. Those are the words of our next guest, Desmond Cole, explaining why he left his bi-monthly column at the Toronto Star. Last month, Cole protested a Toronto Police Services Board meeting and was subsequently told by his editor at the Star that he had violated the newspaper's rules on journalism and activism. In his writings, Cole has long criticized the controversial police practice of carding, stopping, interrogating, and collecting data on individuals without a probable cause, a practice which disproportionately targets people of color in Canada. In 2015, he wrote a widely read piece for Toronto Life titled, "The Skin I'm In, I've been interrogated by police more than 50 times, all because I'm black." Last month, Cole brought a police board hearing to a halt by refusing to leave the speaker's chair until all information gathered from carding was destroyed.
I stand up for the children of this city that you guys refuse to protect, particularly the black children. And I plan to stand here in protest until you commit today, here, and now to restricting the police having our information going forward. You're going to ruin another generation of children's lives, and I'm not going to allow you to do it.
Thanks, Desmond. Well, please have the courtesy to let the other people on the list speak. No, we can't solve it that. So let's adjourn the meeting for 10 minutes, please, and board members.
So you were just listening to Desmond Cole derailing a Toronto Police Services Board meeting last month. Shortly afterwards, Desmond was called into the Toronto Star's office and told his protest had violated the newspaper's code of conduct. The newspaper's Policy and Journalistic Standards Manual states, quote, "It's not appropriate for Star journalists to play the roles of both actor and critic." Desmond Cole says this is not the first time he's been reprimanded by the newspaper. Last year, the chair of Tour Star Corp, who was also serving as the Star's acting publisher at the time, asked to meet with Desmond. The chair, John Hondrick, reportedly told Desmond he was writing about race too often and advised him to diversify his topics. Well, Democracy Now! Invited John Hondrick, or a spokesperson for the Toronto Star, to join us on the show. They declined our request. The newspaper's Director of Community Relations and Communications pointed us to a column by the paper's public editor, Kathy English. The column is headlined, "Journalists Shouldn't Become the News." Well, for the remainder of the hour, we're joined by Desmond Cole, former columnist for the Toronto Star, now a freelance journalist, activist, radio host on News Talk 1010. Desmond, welcome back to Democracy Now!
It's nice to see both of you.
We last spoke to you in CBC's studios when we were in Toronto. You were a Toronto Star columnist, so talk about what happened.
Well, I think you described it very well. I have been a columnist, had been a columnist since about September of 2015. And there was no surprise to the newspaper that I was engaging in activism. In fact, the Toronto Star's reporters have been covering my activism since I became a columnist at the paper and have been describing me as a freelance journalist and an activist. The idea that I broke their policy is nonsense because the Toronto Star's policy is inconsistent at best and is not applied to other writers and columnists of that same paper that also engage in different forms of activism. My analysis of what happened to me is that because I am working in the service of black liberation, because I'm fighting white supremacy, and because that requires me to engage in acts of civil disobedience, as I did at the police board meeting, that John Hondrick, whom you mentioned, became too uncomfortable with my actions to feel comfortable supporting me going forward as a columnist. So they made up this nonsense about the idea that I was breaking the rules of the newspaper rather than simply saying, we're uncomfortable. Perhaps John Hondrick and others at the Star were receiving a lot of phone calls, I imagine. I disrupted a police services board meeting at which the mayor of the city of Toronto, John Tory, was present. I acknowledge that things like that make our government and many of our business and even newspaper leaders very uncomfortable. That's their problem, though. For John Hondrick to have come to me a year ago and to try and interfere in my content as an opinion writer in this city, that was ludicrous. And that's really the story here, is why is one of the most powerful people at the Toronto Star coming to me and trying to divert my work and trying to suggest that I should be talking about this or that. That wasn't, in my view, his role. And he was really out of line also because I've brought a lot of attention to issues that the Star has been covering for years and done it successfully. So to me, this is about one very powerful person on a power trip and the very inappropriate actions he was taking more than a year ago up until now to try and silence me.
Well, what you raise about the publisher, someone who has worked in commercial media for 40 years, I can't remember ever a publisher of a newspaper, and I was a staff columnist, not just as you were a freelance columnist, having a meeting with one of the columnists or one of the reporters to discuss the content of their work. It doesn't happen.
Believe me, he tried. John Hondrick at that meeting tried to make it seem like it was normal for him in his position to come to somebody who was writing once a week to have this big conversation about my content. He tried to make that seem like that was a normal thing, and certainly the media in Canada have been very afraid to pick up on that thread of this issue. They have preferred to have this really ridiculous faux existential conversation about what does this mean for journalism? What is journalism anyway? Can one be a journalist and an activist? This has all diverted from the fact that I took a stand against police keeping records on innocent people because everyone up to the mayor of our city of Toronto has said that that practice is illicit and has to stop, but they have not followed through. So all of these conversations about my tactics as an individual to try and silence that, these are classic diversionary tactics when black people take a stand.
You have said, Desmond, that you've been stopped over 50 times. You can just throw that out of your,
Stopped
by police.
Or followed in my car, or questioned and asked for information. That's in Kingston, Ontario, where I went to university. That's here in Toronto. That's in different parts of this province. And even when I leave the province of Ontario, no matter where I am in this country, it's extremely hard as a younger black person not to attract the attention of police. And I'm terrified when these interactions happen. But again, the reason we've been having this conversation about carding in Toronto.
And explain what carding is.
Yes, and again, you guys did a great job in your intro. It is the practice of not only stopping people, civilians who are not suspected of any crime, but documenting your interactions with them and keeping them in a database. So keeping non-criminal records of civilians. This has been a rampant practice in the city of Toronto. There are very, very few black families and individuals that this practice has not touched in one way or another. More recently, we've been talking about how even police stationed in our schools are engaging in surveillance against students, are collecting information on students as so-called school resource officers who are posted in our high schools when they're supposed to be building relationships, as they like to put it, with our kids. So these records, these non-criminal records, can follow people when they try to apply for a job, when they try to apply for school positions that require background checks. And they create a kind of a picture of somebody who's doing something wrong, who's just trying to live in their community. This has disproportionately affected black people in Toronto, but it has also disproportionately affected queer and trans communities. It has also disproportionately affected the homeless, people with mental health issues, the kinds of people in our society who are vulnerable and who are easier targets for police because the rest of society is not used to standing up for them and protecting them. So this is not a referendum on myself or the number of times that I've been stopped. This is a rampant police practice that is about oppressing and documenting people of color and other marginalized groups.
We're going to do part 2 in a moment and ask you, what are you going to do right now? What would you be writing about? That's Desmond Cole. We're in Toronto, Ontario, in Canada. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Stay tuned.